and the Sydney Corpus Lab at the University of Sydney. So in our first talk, Monica Bednarek talked to us about new tools and techniques in text analytics, and today we're going to hear from Professor Tony McEnery, who's going to talk to us about using approaches to text analytics broadly conceived to look at time, to look at language in time and language change and those kinds of issues. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Tony. So Tony, whenever you're ready to start sharing your slides, you can do that.
Yeah, there we are. Can you see that, Gavin?
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, good. Right, in that case, I'll start to talk, and feel free to stop me if you need to, Gavin. Okay, well, today I'm talking about time, talking about some work I've done with Václav Březina and Helen Baker. We're currently using this, the approach I'm going to talk about today, in another book, which we're doing on Britain and Europe, which should be out next year, looking at 2 centuries of discourse about Britain and Europe. So this is still a technique that I'm using. Okay, so really what I want to do today is start off with some blindingly obvious comments, which are often ignored, I think. And the first blindingly obvious comment is that words change their usage over time and across contexts. So when we're looking at words, for example, we find that they're highly dynamic. If we study a word at one moment in time, then if we go somewhat distant from that, say 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we may well find changes of usage. Now, note that I'm using the word usage because although what I'm saying today will touch upon meaning, there are other ways in which words behave as well, of course, and other interfaces to meaning. So we find grammatical change, for example, or use in certain registers changing over time. So I'll use this broad term, usage, and we find usage changing over time and across contexts. Here are 2 examples just to sort of illustrate that briefly. If this was a normal lecture theatre, I'd have you guessing at what the word was. But in the first case, it's the word show, and these are collocates of it, taken from material from the 21st century British English. And the second set of words that you see there, picture, cinema, garrison, sea, good, not, back, was, a, wet, are again collocates of the word show. But this time from the early 1940s, I took these from my grandfather's war diaries, which I have, and I looked at collocates of the word show. And for him, show principally meant a cinema performance, something which really I don't think is used now anymore. But at the time, it was the main way in which he would refer to going to see a film. So 2 differences there, a difference in time. I don't really think we talk about going to see a show when we go to the cinema anymore, and a different across contexts. In the first case, a broad general corpus, and in the second case, a very specific corpus in a very specific context. And of course, these changes in usage can be prompted by a range of things, changes in society. So a classic, if you look at the BNC 1994 and the BNC 2014 spoken, and you look at the word web, you see that it changed its meaning quite dramatically and its usage quite dramatically across that time span because of the invention of the World Wide Web. There was no language internal process that drove that change. It was a change in society. And culture and technology requiring new naming strategies for new or modified concepts is something that we're increasingly familiar with. And it's a very good example of how social change can actually drive along linguistic change. So social and historical context may mean usage is formed, becomes productive, or retreats to being receptive. This is actually a key point that was made by Michael Hoey in his work on lexical priming, that once we have lexical primings, if you like, once we know the company that a word keeps, it doesn't simply go away if we are not productive in terms of producing that word with those collocates, for example. So he gave some examples, but certainly some work I've done with Helen, we looked at Turks and the Turkish in the 17th century, and there are periods of time when Turks aren't mentioned, but when they are mentioned, they're mentioned with similar collocates to the ones that they were mentioned with in the past. And that's because, of course, we'd argue that Turk and its collocates became receptive rather than productive for certain periods of time. It isn't that everybody forgot the Turks and how to talk about them. It's just that they stopped talking about them, but remembered the collocates that the word had. So with a corpus, what we see, of course, is productive knowledge. But behind that is receptive knowledge sometimes also. People aren't actually producing that form or that usage, but they may well still know it, and when given an appropriate prompt, will still produce it. So changes in patterns of usage are a simple recurrent fact. Some of these represent long-term crowdsourced drifts in essence. We can actually look across long periods of time and see changes happening that weren't commanded by somebody. They were actually a side effect of interaction in a community of speakers or writers. And we'll definitely see some examples of that today. But of course, that change may be near term or longer term. Sometimes the word brachychrony is used for relatively short or near term changes, and the longer term change we can describe as diachronic. But really, we're looking at change in both cases. Now, it creates a real issue in dense time series data for corpus linguists, or a real opportunity. There's relatively little work looking at change over time in language using very large dense time series data sets. I'll mention some of it in a moment. But really, we're standing on the precipice of being able to do something quite interesting. Of course, we can do simple-minded analyses, but actually trying to look at the data and make sense of it and engage with it in some meaningful way takes a little bit more thought. So I'd say what's needed is caution rather than paralysis. Now, Nevalainen, actually, I think her quote is inspired by Labov, reminds us that in historical corpus inquiries, we often need to make the best use of bad data. So in the data set that I'm looking at today, which I'll introduce shortly, it's a very large, relatively unstructured data set. In some ways, it could be viewed as bad data because, say, for example, there wasn't any information on genre included in the corpus originally. The other data sets are even worse behaved. So I've done work with the 19th century newspaper corpus in the UK, which is full of OCR errors. But I'd always say that rather than walking away from these data sets and saying, oh, they're too messy, too noisy, we should think of the opportunity that they represent, very large time series data, which may allow us to look at historical change in ways that haven't been looked at before, and then make the best use of that bad data. And today, in some ways, this talk is about making the best use of bad data. Now, I've mentioned that there has been previous work looking at diachronic change, and I'll give you a list of references there that I'd encourage you to follow up. I think, by the way, after this talk, Emma will be sending you a copy of the slides as a handout, so don't feel that you need to take photographs of the screen or frantically scribble while I'm talking. You can just listen if you like, and then look at the handout later on. So there's a range of work there, a lot of it focused on grammatical change, semantic change, etc. What we wanted to do was build a more general tool that would allow us as linguists to interact with large data sets, looking at points in time where change happens to be occurring. I'll return to this point in a moment because it's actually key in terms of our engagement with this general problem, what we're trying to do. But for now, I'll leave you just with those references and encourage you to follow them up if you'd like to see some other work on semantic and other change over time using large data sets. Okay, so I've finished the preamble. I'll now give you an overview of the talk itself. I'll talk about diachronic change in word usage and often meaning. I'll introduce a technique called usage fluctuation analysis, which is a method of calculation and also a method of use. And I'll introduce 4 short case studies, time permitting. I call these something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. The first one is a study of the word whore. The second, a study of the word harlot. The third, a study of the word banker. And the fourth, a study of its. So let's start on that process. Let's think then about diachronic change in usage and meaning. Well, our thought was to approach this question through the window of collocation. Now, if collocation the basic idea that words associate with other words in relatively constrained contexts, and you can observe those interactions, and where they occur in some way with a frequency that's greater than you'd expect, you have some type of relationship between those two words. Similar idea, of course, of word embeddings that are popular in computational linguistics. Then it follows that it's no more possible to talk about a word having static collocates than it is to talk of a word having static usage. So people often talk about the collocates of a word. Well, at any given moment in time, you might be able to talk about the collocates of a word. But even there, I'd say that they were actually probably distinguished by speaker, in that we might have slightly different patterns of collocation across a population. Or it can be distinguished by context. Across different contexts, we might have slightly differing patterns of collocation. But it's a very certain bet to say that over time, a population of speakers will exhibit different patterns of collocation. I've already shown you that with one small example this morning, and I've referred to another example, the example of Webb, which demonstrates it very easily. Yet while demonstrating this is easy, what is more complex, and for me is the domain of research proper, is answering a series of questions about observed changes. So it's fine for me to say, hey, collocates, they change over time. Isn't that cool? Well, no. What is cool is actually thinking about that in a structured fashion and trying to answer a series of questions relating to the observation. So when did the change occur? If we know that there is a shift, say, for example, in the word web, precisely when did it occur? And how often did the word change its usage? Did the words change their usage very regularly? Is there something like a sort of bus timetable that you could get for words where you'd say, oh, it's about to change, 10 years, it's going to change? Or is in fact the situation much more dynamic than that? How enduring were the usages attached to the word? So if a word changes its meaning, does it ever go back, or are those meanings relatively transient on occasion, forced upon the speaker by an unusual set of circumstances, but unlikely to persist, for example? So how stable or otherwise was the usage of the word over time? Back to the bus timetable idea. Is it very regular? Do all words undergo routine, regular change in patterns of usage? Or in fact, is it very irregular? Now, answers to these allow us to approach explanations for change. If I can see, for example, that there is an irregular pattern of change across words, and maybe some words don't change at all within a period that I'm looking at, what is the explanation for that? What am I looking at? There may be linguistic processes proper, grammaticalization, for example, but even that, of course, has a social dimension to it. Or there may be purely social explanations, as with Web, for example, where something comes along, it is named, the World Wide Web, and as a consequence, language then adapts to reflect that social change. So once we have questions like that, once we have some of the answers, we can then start to look for plausible explanations that actually match our observations. Now, an initial approach that I took with Helen, actually, to looking at semantic change over time was this book here, Corpus Linguistics and 17th-Century Prostitution. We decided to try to look at changing patterns of meaning and representations of prostitutes in the 17th century. To do so, we used the EBO corpus, which you'll hear more about throughout this talk, but that's about 1 billion words of data for the 17th century, all nicely keyed in by humans, so it's relatively accurate. And we thought that we'd check, as a historian, in Helen's case, as a linguist in my case, what the data looked like. Did the data actually well match what historians had said about prostitution in the period, or did it challenge it? Did what the historians had said about prostitution challenge in any way the linguistic analysis? So it was very much a dialogue between the two of us as a historian and a linguist. What we came up with in that book was an approach to looking at change over time based on chunking. We divided the century into decades. We'd look at collocates within the first decade, second decade, third decade, etc. Now, when we were doing it, we understood very well, of course, that that was an artificial imposition. Decades are a human invention that don't have any true meaning. And certainly they don't have any linguistic meaning. It isn't that, as we approach the end of a decade, we actually get out a new dictionary and change the language. That's not what happens. This was purely a simplification for the purpose of modeling. So we split the century into decades. It gives rise to inevitable cliff edges. So, for example, if you look at a collocate and it appears in one decade but not the next, you could give the misleading impression that the collocate winks out of existence at midnight in 1609, at the end of the year, and 1610, you don't have the collocate anymore. Obviously, that's not what happens, but the cliff edges that you get in the analysis could imply that. And of course, points of change which have been less than 10 years in duration are fixed as 10-year blocks. So there could be, say, for example, a period of innovation in the middle of a decade, and that shows up in your analysis, but it will show up as being a decade long. Nonetheless, as a simplification, it allowed us to deal with bad data, and we were making best use of it. And out of it, we made a series of observations about the nature of some of these changes, and they're simple observations. We noted that some of the collocates are actually consistent across the time period. They appear in most, if not all, of the decade-long blocks. Some of the collocations are transient. They occur in only one decade. They're not there before, they're not there afterwards. They just wink out of existence as fast as they come into existence. Some of them are initiating. They're not there at the beginning of the century, but say after 30 years, this collocate appears and stays for the rest of the century. And sometimes they're terminating. The collocate is there at the beginning of the century, but maybe halfway through it vanishes. If you're interested in reading more of that analysis and our findings based upon it, the book is actually available at that URL for free. You can download the whole book. But as I say, you're getting a copy of these slides, so don't feel compelled to write down that very unhelpful address quickly. Okay, so to our main point, not all changes are driven along by language internal processes. Some occur as social reality shifts and language shifts with it. So in the 17th century, for example, we know that there were a range of changes, profound social changes, that were likely to have had an impact upon people's perceptions of prostitution. There's a particular period of liberalization in the 1660s, for example, and we could have expected that just on the basis of the historiography to mean that we'd see a shift in that period. Also, of course, we have to remember that with collocation, we're reflecting different types of relationship in language, not just meaning. And that's why we talk about usage rather than meaning. Initially, we did call it meaning fluctuation analysis, but we realized it was as useful for looking at semantic, grammatical, or say discourse-related change as it was for looking at semantic change. So we actually identified it as usage change. But how can we explore usage change and avoid some of the pitfalls of aggregation inherent in the decade approach? So in the decade approach, we're pushing everything together and looking at it a decade at a time. But in fact, as I've said, there may be changes which are working into a finer grain of detail than that. Now, more data is not the answer to the 17th century because I think there's barely any more data to produce. We can't go out and collect more. EBO has most of the data from the 17th century that's available in English or printed in Britain that there is to have. So we can't just sit back and get more data. So we have to do something else. Now, one of the issues and one of the reasons that we put the data into decades is frequency. For some of the words that we were looking at, if you tried, say, for example, to do a year-by-year approach to looking at the data, most of the years would have zeros in them for a particular word. And sometimes, even where it wasn't zero, the number would be low enough that you wouldn't actually observe collocation. So aggregation into decades allowed us to, if you like, bunch the data together to start to make observations. But what we wanted to do with UFA is attempt to overcome that type of problem, the basic problem of frequency, by using automatic and manual methods for dealing with shifts of usage. It combines statistical sophistication with manual qualitative analysis. So here is what we're doing. What we want is a technique which shows us the pattern of usage over time. And then we as analysts want to use that pattern to downsample. So we want to look at specific parts of the distribution and say we'll focus our energy as analysts there because the overall characterization of the data is suggesting that the type of change that we're interested in is occurring at that point. So we're not trying to automate the process of understanding. What we're trying to do is use these techniques in order to guide us as analysts to the type of change that we're interested in so that we can use our time to carry out qualitative analyses, quick concordancing, all those things, in order to look at the data and explain it. So this technique indicates places where usage change occurs and which may deserve particular attention of the analyst. Another thing which will become apparent in a moment when I show you one of the graphs is that the graph shows you quite a few things. Of course, you as an analyst may actually approach the data with a specific question, and you may not be interested in some of the things that the graph is showing you. And that's fine. What we didn't want to do is just produce a technique which only allowed us to answer one question. We have a broad technique which the analysts bring their questions to, and they may find that they can use that technique to look at specific types of change that we weren't necessarily interested in. I'll illustrate that point more in a moment when I show you a graph. The great thing is that the analyst does not have to deal with thousands of examples of a word's use over a large period of time, but can focus only on a relevant subset, that idea of downsampling. If you want to read more about the technique itself and the mathematical details of it, you can look at this paper here. Again, that's available, open access, and that explains it all to you. But in simple terms, what are the components of the technique? Well, firstly, we identify collocates of a word of interest, a node, so in our case, maybe the word whore, across a period of time. We use an overlapping sliding window which moves through the time series data within which collocates are identified. So we're still aggregating. So say, for example, we could set our sliding window to 5 years, but because we're just sliding it along, say 1 year at a time, we can actually get an idea of where the change is occurring within a 10-year period, because we get several sample points out of that 10 years. There's also then a recursive estimation of the difference between collocates at any 2 consecutive points in the sliding window. So I start off with one sliding window, calculate the collocates, shift it along by a year, calculate the collocates again, and then calculate some difference between the first set of collocates and the second. Are they the same or are they different? And if they're different, to what degree are they different? And for those of you interested in such things, we apply a statistical regression model to the difference estimate. You can read about that in a paper that I did with a few other colleagues in 2012. So we built on that work as well. Now note that the period of time, that first point, isn't fixed. You as an analyst can fix that. So if you have an incredibly rich time series, well, you might set a much shorter window than 5 years. Say, for example, if you're looking at 21st century newspaper data with a very frequent topic, you may even be able to set the time period to a window or a window of 1 day or 3 or 4 days, something like that. But in our case, we used a window of 5 years because we had far less data. So it's a very flexible technique in that respect. And this is what the output looks like, a sort of wriggling worm type thing which goes across the century. Down here at the bottom of the screen, we have time running. And up the side here, note, by the way, I've only given you the upper part of the distribution because otherwise the thing would just be floating off at the top. But note, in reality, it starts at 0, but I'm starting at 0.75 for the purpose of illustration. We also then at the side have this estimate of how similar the windows are. And the little dots that you can see scattered across the graph are the individual observations that we've made within a window, or between two windows rather. Okay, so let me just explain how to read one of these, where we get an arrow going up, as we do here. You get the slope going up. We have a convergent change occurring. Over time, the two windows that we're looking at successively are becoming more similar to one another. Or we can have a divergent change, as we have here between 1610 and 1620, where over time, the two windows that we're comparing to one another are becoming increasingly different. Or we can have stability. There is a stability of change. There isn't one on this graph. We'll see one, what looks like one much later on. But if, say, for example, we got to a point here in the graph and it was a straight line, what it would be saying is the rate of change is the same, but there is still a change. There's still a difference. Whereas if the line was here, where we actually have the maximum value of similarity, 1, it would be saying the window is identical over time. The stability is there in terms of no change. Okay, so that's really how to read one of those graphs very simply. Of course, you have outliers. Here we're showing you the regression itself, and these are standard deviations from it. Some go beyond it. So this is a convergent outlier. It's a window where between 2 years, comparison of two windows produced identical results. So you do get these little peaks of similarity from time to time. Or you can get divergent outliers. In a pattern where generally we're seeing with the regression that things are similar, you can get the odd observation that falls outside of that pattern. And you can get local maximums of agreement. There's a period here around 1650, and that turns out to be an important date, as you'll see shortly. We get this build-up, this convergent change building up to a period of time where you actually have a series of windows which actually are identical to one another, and then difference sets in again. So this looks like some type of local maximum of agreement that we achieve within that century. And the local minimum of agreement, where the word seems to be in flux most, if you like, occurs around here. Okay. Let's look at the word web. And we can see, we can break that into periods, into types as we did before: consistent, initiating, terminating, transient. Consistent. These are the words which consistently collocate with the word web in the 17th century. So this is derived from the system itself. It spits out these answers and tells you, for that graph, these are the words throughout, irrespective of the movement of the graph, which actually remain consistent. So throughout the 17th century, spiders have webs, spiders weave webs, etc. Interestingly, for the word web, nothing initiates. There are no new collocates added to the word in the century that stay. Non-terminate. No collocates are thrown away after a long period of being a collocate of the word. But there are lots of transient collocates there. So UFA offers offers answers to 4 main questions related to the diachronic analysis of collocates. What counts as a relevant collocate to look at? If your question is about stability, then the answer is the consistent collocates. How does one refine or define a relevant historical period? Well, we don't really need to. The only period that we need to define is the window, which seems to be the one which captures the collocates that allow us to make the comparisons, that allow us to generate the graph. And through the graph, we can look at relevant historical periods, periods in which we can see that there's a similarity of usage change occurring, for example. And how does one compare collocate profiles over time? The technique does exactly that. And how does one identify statistically points of change? Once again, the technique does that. But note that throughout, we test this against textual reality. The one thing that we don't do is to look at a graph like that and draw our conclusions from it. This is our entry point into the data. So if I was interested, say, for example, in the, 1650s, I could look at this graph and say, well, actually, interestingly, it looks as though there's a lot of agreement about the use of the word web in the 1650s here. Why don't I go in and look at why? Or if I'm just interested, say, in a period when the word was undergoing a lot of change, I might look here. So we can use the graph in conjunction with our research questions to guide our close reading of the text to try and understand what the graph is showing us. We see that more clearly if we move on to look at our first case study, whore. Now, this is a UFA of the word whore. It sort of looks like a bit of a bat or a hovering ghost, I think. But there we have it. And in this slide, by the way, there'll be a little child, some schoolboyish humor. I hope you find it entertaining. This is the graph for whore. We see this convergent slope, divergent, then a very marked convergent slope, and it bounces around like that. So what causes that to happen? If we go in and sample at different points, we can find out why. So why is this divergence happening here? Well, it's anti-Catholic sentiment, which is common in Britain at this time. But this is a period, of course, before something happens in Britain, the Civil War, which is in part a religious war, and the idea of Catholic influence, which the Whore of Babylon represents to some extent, as we'll see, is very topical. So this word is being drawn in more often, and with it, there is an increasing change in the way that the word is being used. We can look at this one, and we see that it's happening over here as well. And in the 1660s, which I've said is a period of sort of liberal social change, there is a marked difference in the use of the word whore. It changes again, but it's becoming convergent here. And actually, largely, the convergence is driven by dropping of references to the Whore of Babylon and a focus instead on the actual social actor of a whore, a prostitute. And it's very marked and it's very negative. And it's very interesting in looking at this graph that one of the things we find is that many of the observations that we make in the book based on the chunking method are here refined and reinforced. So those are things that we noted within the book, and we can see it happening here much more clearly. Also, after that point, however, we get this divergent slope, and that's driven along by the word whore becoming an insult. So as well as describing the Whore of Babylon, prostitutes themselves, later in the century, the word also becomes frequently used as an insult to just call somebody a whore without actually saying that they are somebody who sells sex for money. So we can see again another driver of this change when we look back at the data. So it makes sense when we actually return to the data, and it makes sense when we consider the historiography, the research that the historians have done about work in this period. But that local maximum agreement around 1650 is an interesting one to look at. It actually peaks. So we have this increased divergence here as obsessive mentions of the Whore of Babylon become the norm. And then afterwards, we have this convergent slope and finally a peak. And the peak really represents to some extent this process finishing, the focus on the Whore of Babylon. And then because the Whore of Babylon is the one that's spoken about mostly, we get this convergence and then a peak around 1650 of the discussion of the Whore of Babylon herself. These are the words that are used there, and the red ones are the ones that appear at the peak. The words like Antichrist, Babylon, beast, cup, desolate, drunk, forehead, fornication, hate, mother, Rev, standing for Revelations, the book of the Bible in which the whore is mentioned, Rome, scarlet, sits, waters, whore, and then we have these initiating collocates, dragon, which comes in 1650, false, mystery, 1640s, And we have some terminating collocates which were there at the beginning of the century, but which fall away, like Babylon and purple. So I've not listed all of the transient collocates there due to space limitations, but a lot of those are focused around that period in the middle of the century, when the whore of Babylon becomes a very important and very central metaphor. The whore, of course, was thought to ride on a chariot. The complex imagery around the whore of Babylon, its relationship to Rome, is there. She has the cup of fornications, which she holds, which explains why cup is part of the collocates. She rides a seven-headed dragon, which also explains why dragon is there. But it's really the scarlet robes, which you can see there, and also the mention of Rome, which give the most clear indication that she's seen as a sign of Catholicism, and the Catholicism which will bring about the end of the world in the opinions of the writers. So really what happens in the middle of the century is a very complex thing. We have a metaphor for Catholicism taken from the Bible, which becomes so central to and so frequently mentioned in terms of the usage of the word whore that it begins to dominate, and all of the things associated with the whore, the fornications, the dragon, etc., become the key collocates of it. So when we were looking at that divergence and then convergence slope, we were seeing this process come in with these collocates coming in from the whore and then being on the convergence slope, the ones that were mainly there. What about the word harlot, which we might think of as a near synonym of whore? Well, the graph interestingly looks similar in that around 1650 we have this peak occurring. What do we see if we actually look at some of these points to try and understand what this graph is telling us? Well, interestingly, we had also in the chunking analysis identified 1650 as a period when collocation was peaking. So we were quite pleased to see that corroborated through this graph. And we also identified the 1620s and 30s as a period where there seems to be a reduced range of usage. The word harlot was actually narrowing its usage. It was shedding collocates around that time, causing that divergent slope. Volume of evidence is not the driver. So you could say, well, maybe it's shedding collocates because there are fewer examples, so you're not seeing the collocates, and there are more examples in the 1650s, so you are seeing the collocates. So to some extent, your technique is sensitive to the volume of data. That's certainly a criticism to be aware of, but it doesn't actually apply in this case when you actually look at the underlying data. It isn't the case that the peaks occur where there's more data and the troughs occur where there's less. So what is it? Well, actually, we see things like in the early period, it gains collocates on a converging slope, and these actually look more like the word harlot used relating to the sale of sex, partly because of the appearance of this word bawd, which you can think of as an early modern English near synonym of the modern form pimp. So we can guess that that was there. But the detachment and reattachment to harlot of the word repenting occurs in sustained periods throughout the century. So we actually see it coming in as an idea, going out as an idea. So this is probably one of those things where we have something which remains a receptive collocate throughout, but the cause of its production changes. Also over here, it gains collocates on a divergent slope. Oh, sorry, there. And the religion collocates are apparently stable, so there's something else going on that slope. And actually what we see are the word returning to a usage which looks as though it's associated with prostitution. It's taking on words like hire, painted, young, etc. So we seem to see periods in which religion is forcing this change as some collocates come out and in, becoming receptive and productive. We see the word initially seeming to be associated with the actual social process of prostitution, and then again there. So it seems to be a tug of war in this word between its use in terms of religion and its use in terms of the social process or the social action of prostitution. actually, if we start to look here at the religious collocates that generate the divergence, we can start to guess at why the religion issue is coming in and out, and why we have the peak in the 1650s. We're seeing collocates which are very similar to the collocates for whore, and indeed whore becomes a collocate of harlot. And indeed, when we look at examples, we see that harlot is being used as a near synonym of whore when talking about the whore of Babylon. So the whore of Babylon once again explains why the word harlot, which starts being associated in all likelihood with the social process of prostitution and ends that way, but in the middle, the dominance of the whore of Babylon in discourse is such that the near collocate harlot gets sucked into the discourse around the whore of Babylon, and that introduces these collocates to it and produces this tug-of-war effect, if you like, between the word being associated with prostitution or being associated with the whore of Babylon. Okay. Let's move on to another case study, the word banker. Banker, I'll leave you to read that stuff there about the history of banking in the UK, but banker is an interesting word because to some extent the social action or the social process of banking was somewhat taboo in the UK up to the end of the 17th century. It was associated with usury, and usury was frowned upon. So we might expect just from the historiography that we should see a dramatic change in the word banker in the 17th century, because we know that the social and legal processes around banking changed dramatically in that period. So what do we actually see if we look at it? Well, interestingly, we see exactly that. So it's just a nice proof of concept for the technique that the historiography suggested that we should see a dramatic change that would look rather like this. And that is indeed what we should see. So we see here, there's one which says complete convergence. We have a pattern of collocation around the word banker, which is actually very similar and relatively stable, almost one of those plateaus that I talked about before, up through to the 1660s. And then in the 1660s, we have this divergent trend. The word is really changing its meaning. It's taking on new collocates. So each window that we compare to the next one seems different until we reach this point here, a local minimum, and then it starts to climb. I'm sure that we have more data going into the 17th century. We would see it maybe climbing back up towards another of those, but the major change in the usage of the word seems to be triggered around 1660. So we have this long stable period characterized by no consistent patterning, with usurers being the only consistent collocate. Bankers are usurers. That simple, if you like, equivalence generates this long period of plateau. But here we have an increasing frequency of the word banker, which helps. So that's part of the change here. But usurers, crucially, also ceases to be a collocate. So this period here, we have usurers is the collocate. This period here, usurers is no longer a collocate. The word banker increases in frequency. And the range of collocates around the word banker broadens, generating this divergent slope. So the types of collocates that we get are collocates that we might recognize from the modern usage of the word banker. We have collocates relating to commerce, such as the word trade. We have social actors linked to commerce, brokers, goldsmiths, merchants. We have financial concepts and processes associated with the finance system, credit, and paid. And we have specific locations, London. Also, interestingly, it's gendered. Bankers are men. And we see this honorific Mr. associated with the word banker. So, as the historiography predicts, around this period, when the Bank of England starts to be an idea and banking is changed in terms of the social attitudes towards it in British society, we see something of a cliff edge here. A long period of time when bankers are simply usurers, they stop being usurers, and instead they become associated with commerce, They become associated with finance, they become associated with London, and they become associated with men. So that actually reflects the historiography pretty well. The word goldsmiths is there because they were the ones who started dealing in foreign domestic coins and transformed into England's first bankers. And when you go down into the city of London, you can still find references to goldsmiths. And also Lombard Street in London took its name from the Italian goldsmiths that used to work there. So it actually matches the historiography quite well. Let's finish by looking at an example where we're looking at a grammatical word. So far, we've looked at words, open class words. What happens if we actually instead look at a closed class word like its? Its is an interesting one. We've got some previous corpus-based studies we can compare our results to. But those studies are actually based on relatively small data sets, like the Corpus of English Dialogues, 1.18 million words. The Corpus of Early Modern Correspondence, 2.7 million words, and the Helsinki Corpus. We have the Igbo Corpus, so we've got 1 million words to look in the 17th, 1 billion words to look at in the 17th century, rather than close to about 5 billion words that previous studies had available to them. Of course, Culpeper and Coulter split the 17th century into chunks for reasons that I've already explained. When you're dealing with these large data sets, in order to get frequencies that are worth looking at, you often aggregate. And they aggregated into 3 periods, 1600 to 1640, 1640 to 18, and 80 to 1720. They went for the long 17th century. But actually, they only gathered 2 examples of it in the Helsinki corpus in this period. So the data was very slim. Nonetheless, they argued that it undergoes a shift in usage from what they guessed was about 1640 onwards. Why 1640? Well, we're back at that chunking cliff edge effect, because that's where you get the split between the 2 blocks of data, 1600, 1640, and 1640, 1680, in which they can see the difference. So they have those 2 windows. They see a difference between the 2. So they hypothesize that there's a shift in usage from around 1640. Thinking back to what I said earlier in the talk, it could well be the case, for example, that the change actually occurs during 1610 or during 1620, because it could really appear at any point in that first window. So what we find with it is it slowly supplants completing choices for such as of it, for expressing what Culpeper and Coulter call the third person neuter possessive. Okay, so what do we find? If we run the UFA on the 17th century, looking at the word its, we actually find that we get to our peak of divergence, or the local minimum, actually just before about 1620. So they'd had to estimate it occurred here because that's what their data allowed them to say. But with the sliding window technique, we can see that the peak of the change, or the trough of it, if you like, seems to occur about 20 years before the end of that block. This divergence slope is generated by its rapidly acquiring collocates. It's undergoing real change. It's attracting collocates to it as though it had gravity. And then when the rapid acquisition of collocates ceases, the windows start to become similar to one another again, until finally you get some collocates added, which causes this wobbling. But in fact, you've really got a plateau, and it's very close to 1, which is up here. So you've got stability after that. The real change seems to occur in about the first 2 decades of the 17th century, and it seems to come to a halt around the 1620s. And actually, by the time we get to the 1640s, which Culpeper and Coulter had talked about, the change is over. In fact, it doesn't occur then. It's occurred some time before. Okay. So actually, I should mention that the mention of Lebov is that this is the sort of classic S-shaped curve that people talk about in sociolinguistics when they're talking about change spreading through language. What do we find? Well, actually, if we look at the collocation, we can see that the key period is the one that I've identified. Then there's some wobbling around later on, but the main action is actually around NM1, occurring in the R1 position, so just to the right of the word its, so its foot, its head, that type of thing. And indeed, that aligns very well with this quote from Barber, Johansen and Leach, talking about the grammar of the word in the modern language. And also, if you look in the BNC 2014, most of the things that occur in this slot after its are indeed nouns. So we see that modern grammar formed in this period. We also get plurals. There's an example from the Corpus in 1618. And we also get some other patterns introduced later on where you can sort of pre-modify the noun instead. If we look at the individual parts of speech and look at their occurrence close to its, we can see that change starting here, but really kicking in terms of frequency later in the century. Okay, same with that. So we see those patterns. One thing that we haven't looked at so far is the question of context. And some of you may be sitting there thinking, well, actually, Tony, you talked about context and time at the beginning. You focused on time, and it could well be that some of the changes in time that you showed us actually disguise changes in context. You're aggregating together context just in the same way as you previously aggregated together time. One of the responses to that we came up with was to actually go through and make a sort of provisional genre classification of the Ebo corpus, which then I think Jonathan used and developed for his new work on Shakespeare's language in the time. That's to one side. This is actually a chart where we give those examples of its and its distribution across the domains in the 17th century. And we actually see it's the domain of science writing, or science and astrology, as we call it at the time, where actually most of that action is occurring. Others, it's less important, but it's really science and astrology which seems to be pushing along this innovation. And that actually also is quite interesting because it still persists into present-day English. And again, looking back at the Bible grammar, they say it shows a preference for academic prose, reflecting the non-personal subject matter of the many texts. So just as we found with the example earlier in the talk that I gave you of how context can influence usage, it influences usage here with science and astrology pushing along a lot of this innovation. And that actually is something which persists into present-day English in terms of preference and usage for the word its. So if you look at its in science and astrology by genre, an innovation which started around here is really adapted or adopted by this form, by this register later in the century. So the innovation may not be particularly marked there, but the later usage is. Interestingly, also, if you look at the previous construction that would have been used to express possession and determiner of it rather than its, it has a complementary pattern. If we look at its, we see this peak of this trough here, building back towards a plateau. And if we look at of it, we see a corresponding dip. It's just a bit earlier. So we can see that this is coming out of fashion as that is coming into fashion. That is taking the place of that in terms of its preference for expressing possessive determiners. Okay, if you're interested in using the technique, you can actually go to the Lancaster toolbox, the stats toolbox, and there's a tool there which allows you to actually carry it out if you want to. It brings up a window like that. You can load up your own data to it in a spreadsheet, and you can read more about it in Václav's book as well as the paper that I've given you. So UFA can replicate a previous labor-intensive manual study reliably. That's what we showed with Hall. We got some insights, but largely we replicated that study. Harlot, for which less data was available, we could also look at that, and that's one of the nice things about the sliding window. We can look at these less frequent words, but look at them in some level of detail because we aggregate within a window and then slide it. Banker, The example there showed how long-term change in language can be brought about by change in society. The society changes its attitudes to lending money, the word associated with that changes. And the example with its showed that the technique can work with function words. So you can actually also look at grammatical change using this. So overall, for us, we use this as a rapid means of gisting change and guiding our investigations. An overall plan in the long term is to produce an inventory of graphs and matrices, but I don't know if I'll get this done this side of the grave. But if anybody else ever wanted to do it, it'd be interesting to do so that we could actually look at these things over time in detail. And that, Emma, is that.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. That was really interesting. Yeah, fascinating work, and